Sometimes striving feels like surviving. Sometimes excellence sounds like the only option. It can come wrapped in achievement, in discipline, in a voice that says, if you just try harder, you'll finally be enough. And that is what makes it so hard to recognize. You imagine perfectionism as something admirable, productive, ambitious. But the most dangerous kind is exhausting. It comes without rest. It comes through self-criticism, impossible standards, relentless comparison. It comes through the fear of being seen as anything less than impeccable. Have you ever accomplished something significant and immediately noticed what was wrong with it? Have you ever received praise but felt like a fraud because you know all the flaws others couldn't see? Or have you ever avoided starting something new, not because you lacked interest, but because you couldn't guarantee you'd excel at it? If so, you know that perfectionism isn't about having high standards. Sometimes it's the cage you built from your own expectations. Picture a moment. You've just finished a project. It's good, objectively good. But instead of satisfaction, there's a tightness in your chest. Your eyes scan for errors. Your mind replays every small misstep. Someone compliments your work, and you smile. But inside, you're cataloging everything that should have been better. The world sees success. You see only the distance between what you did and what you believe you should have done. This is how perfectionism begins, not as a pursuit of excellence, but as a defense against worthlessness. When you were young, you learned that your value was measured. Maybe love came with report cards. Maybe approval arrived with trophies. Maybe belonging required proving yourself again and again. So you adapted. You learned that good wasn't good enough. You learned that flawless was the price of acceptance. You learned that your humanity, with all its mess and mistakes, was something to hide. And now, years later, you move through the world with an invisible standard pressed against your spine. Not because you want to be perfect, not because you enjoy the pressure, but because the idea of being flawed still feels like failure to the child living quietly inside your chest who once believed that mistakes meant being unlovable. So perfectionism becomes armor, one that polishes, performs, and never quite rests. Armor that protects you from the fear of being seen as inadequate. But there is a cost. For every time you push yourself beyond exhaustion to meet an impossible standard, you drift further away from the person you could have been if you were allowed to be human. This is the story of how perfectionism grows, first as protection, then as prison. And to understand how it becomes a cage, you must return to where it first began, childhood, where worth was learned as something earned, not inherent. Have you ever seen a child pause before showing their parent a drawing as if even their joy needs approval? That hesitation is where the story begins. Not all wounds leave marks you can see. Some grow in silence, in rooms where love came with conditions attached, where acceptance had prerequisites, where belonging required achievement. You don't remember learning these rules, yet they shaped everything. The rule was simple. If you want to be valued, you must be valuable. And being valuable meant never making mistakes, never falling short, never revealing the messy, uncertain, imperfect parts of being human. Picture a small child at a kitchen table, staring at homework with tears threatening to fall. They got one answer wrong, just one. But the disappointment in the air is thick enough to breathe. Maybe a parent sighs. Maybe a look crosses their face. Maybe nothing is said at all, but the child learns. The lesson is clear. Mistakes are dangerous. Imperfection is failure, and failure means losing love. Or imagine a child who gets praised only when they excel, only when they bring home perfect scores, only when they win, perform, achieve. They learn that love is transactional, that affection must be earned, that their inherent worth is invisible until proven through accomplishment. Their emotional world becomes a constant calculation. Am I enough yet? Have I done enough? What more do I need to prove? Psychologists call this conditional positive regard, the early shaping of how you understand your own value. The developing brain, still soft and forming, learns to associate perfection with safety and mistakes with threat. So you begin to monitor yourself constantly. You check and recheck. You second guess. You criticize your own efforts before anyone else can. You become your own harshest judge because that feels safer than being judged by others. This is the earliest form of perfectionism, but not about achievement, about survival. A child learns that their flaws are unacceptable, so they learn to hide them, to compensate for them, to work endlessly to transcend them. It is not about wanting to be the best. It is about fearing that anything less than perfect means being unworthy of love. So you grow up with a quiet belief stitched into your bones. If I am imperfect, I am unlovable. And that belief does not disappear just because you age. It becomes a standard you learn to carry with trembling hands, with an aching back, with a mind that never quite rests. What you become is not lazy or unmotivated. You become someone who learned to prove their worth before they ever learned to feel it. And the standard you carry into adulthood began in the trembling silence of that child, trying desperately to be good enough to keep. There comes a point where you no longer remember when the pursuit started. It sits in your chest so naturally now that even you forget it's optional. But the truth is, every accomplishment you achieve has a quiet dissatisfaction beneath it. Every success carries a whisper of, but it could have been better. You learned early that being human was risky. So adulthood becomes a performance where you demonstrate competence instead of admitting uncertainty. You move through tasks like a machine, executing flawlessly, anticipating problems before they arise. You triple-check emails, you redo work that's already good. You stay late when others go home, not because you have more to do, but because you cannot leave knowing something might be imperfect. So you become known for your excellence. You become the reliable one, the thorough one, the one who never drops the ball, who never needs help, who never admits struggle. But hidden beneath that competence is exhaustion, the kind that lives in your bones, that makes simple tasks feel mountainous, that turns rest into guilt. Sometimes you snap at people you love, not from cruelty, but from depletion. Sometimes you lie awake replaying a conversation, analyzing every word you said, every moment you might have seemed foolish. Sometimes you avoid new experiences not because you lack interest, but because you cannot tolerate being a beginner again, cannot bear the vulnerability of not immediately excelling. These things are small, quiet patterns, barely visible. But they are prisons, not born from ambition, but from fear. Fear of being exposed as inadequate. Fear of being criticized. Fear of being average. Fear of discovering that beneath all your achievements, you are simply, ordinarily human. Psychologists call this self-worth contingency. When your sense of value depends entirely on external achievement, on never failing, on always performing, your identity becomes fragile. One mistake feels like evidence of your fundamental inadequacy. One criticism feels like proof you were fooling everyone all along. One moment of not knowing something feels like exposure of the fraud you secretly believe yourself to be. In relationships, this looks like being unable to accept help, unable to show weakness, unable to admit when you're struggling. In friendships, it looks like always being the one who has it together until you realize no one knows how to see you as anything but strong. At work, it looks like burnout disguised as dedication, exhaustion dressed up as commitment. Your armor is stitched from achievement, and your smile hides the terror underneath. And here is the truth that stings. You don't strive for perfection because you love excellence. You strive for perfection because you're afraid that if you're anything less, someone will see you as you secretly see yourself, not good enough. But this armor, no matter how polished, is still crushing you slowly. And to understand it fully, we must look at what your mind was trained to believe, where fear wired itself into your psychology. Why does it feel impossible to accept a compliment? Why does your stomach drop when someone points out a small error? The answer isn't oversensitivity, it's wiring. Your brain did not grow around self-acceptance. It grew around self-monitoring, around constant evaluation, around the belief that vigilance prevents rejection. From the moment you were small, your nervous system was tracking feedback. It watched for approval, for disappointment, for the subtle signs that you were measuring up or falling short. It learned which behaviors brought warmth and which brought distance. And if love felt conditional, if belonging required achievement, your brain built a system. Monitor everything, criticize first, never let anyone see you fail. Psychologists understand this through the lens of threat response and cognitive schemas. If your early environment taught you that mistakes were met with withdrawal, criticism, or shame, your amygdala, the brain's threat center, learned to treat imperfection as danger. Your nervous system responded to a small error the way it might respond to a predator, with flooding anxiety, with hypervigilance, with an urgent need to fix, hide, or compensate. And so your brain created what's called a maladaptive schema, a core belief about yourself and the world. I must be perfect to be acceptable. This belief becomes a filter through which you interpret everything. A neutral comment becomes criticism. A small mistake becomes catastrophe. Success becomes temporary relief rather than genuine satisfaction, because you know it only counts until the next test, the next evaluation, the next chance to fail. The prefrontal cortex, your brain's executive function center, becomes overactive, constantly planning, checking, analyzing. You cannot turn off the inner critic because your brain believes that voice is keeping you safe. The dopamine system, which should reward achievement, becomes dysregulated. Accomplishment doesn't bring joy, it brings brief anxiety relief, which isn't the same thing. You're not motivated by wanting to succeed. You're motivated by desperately needing not to fail. This is where perfectionism tightens its grip. Every time you work yourself to exhaustion and avoid criticism, your brain says, "See? The strategy works." Every time you hide a mistake and no one notices, the belief strengthens. Every time you achieve something difficult, the bar simply moves higher. The brain learns that rest is dangerous, that being human is risky, that only flawless performance keeps you safe. But what once protected you, this hypervigilance, this relentless self-criticism, begins to consume you. You find yourself exhausted by your own mind. You achieve things others admire and feel empty. You're surrounded by evidence of your competence, yet convinced at your core that you're inadequate. The brain learned to prioritize perfection over peace. But perfection and living are not the same thing. And at some point, the very strategy that once kept you safe begins to destroy you. Because a life built on proving your worth cannot offer the one thing your heart quietly aches for, to be accepted as you are. And now the shadow begins to show, where protection slowly turns into paralysis. What happens when the thing that once motivated you begins to quietly destroy you? At first, perfectionism feels like strength. It drives you forward, helps you excel, shields you from the shame of mediocrity. It lets you move through the world with a sense of control, a belief that if you just work hard enough, you can avoid failure entirely. But over time, strength becomes brittleness, and the standard you set becomes impossible to maintain. You start to notice it in small moments. Someone asks if you need help, and instead of relief, you feel a flash of panic. Not because you don't need help, but because needing help feels like admitting inadequacy. The real you, the struggling you, the uncertain you, feels too dangerous to reveal. And a thought begins to echo in the back of your mind like a slow-burning truth. If they knew how hard this actually is for me, they wouldn't be impressed anymore. That realization cuts deeper than failure ever could. So, you work harder. You push through exhaustion. You sacrifice sleep, health, relationships, joy, all at the altar of achievement. You tell yourself it's temporary, that once you reach the next milestone, you'll rest. But the milestone moves. The goalpost shifts. The enough you're chasing stays forever out of reach. This is the dark side, the shadow, the cost that perfectionism extracts. You begin to avoid. You procrastinate not from laziness, but from terror. If you never start, you never have to face the possibility of doing it imperfectly. You abandon projects halfway through because they're not turning out as perfectly as you imagined. You say no to opportunities not because you're not interested, but because you cannot guarantee success. The people around you begin to notice something is off, even if they can't name it. You seem stressed, distant, unreachable. They offer reassurance, but you can't hear it. They point out your achievements, but you dismiss them. They tell you you're enough, and some part of you recoils because you know they're wrong. How could they understand? They don't see what you see. Every flaw, every shortcoming, every way you're failing to meet the standard burning in your mind. Psychologists call this cognitive distortion and self-oriented perfectionism. You develop all or nothing thinking. Anything less than perfect is complete failure. You catastrophize. One mistake means everything is ruined. You discount the positive. Achievements don't count because you should have done better. Your inner dialogue becomes abusive in ways you would never speak to another person. The loneliness here is not the loneliness of being alone. It is the loneliness of being trapped inside a mind that never grants peace. It is the loneliness of achieving everything you thought would make you happy and still feeling hollow. And the cruelest irony is this: you did all of this to be valuable. Yet, in chasing perfection, you've lost the ability to experience your own worth. You cannot feel proud while believing you should have done better. You cannot rest while your mind lists everything left undone. You cannot connect authentically while performing flawlessness. And yet, the world often rewards this self-destruction. It praises your work ethic, it celebrates your achievements. It points to you as an example, which leads to the next tragedy: the way society teaches you to keep destroying yourself in the name of success. Have you noticed how the world celebrates the version of you that's slowly burning out? The accomplished one, the disciplined one, the one who never admits struggle. From childhood, you are taught a script: work hard, excel, winners never quit. And while these lessons sound inspiring, they quietly teach you something else. Your worth is your output. Your value is your achievement. Your humanity is acceptable only when it's productive. You learn early that the world loves a polished resume more than it loves a whole person. A person without flaws, without limits, without needs. So you train yourself to meet that expectation. You learn to work through exhaustion. You learn to hide weakness. You learn to frame rest as laziness and boundaries as excuses, and everyone applauds you for it. Teachers called you gifted. Coaches called you dedicated. Parents called you responsible. And slowly you absorbed a message that took root like a weed. Your worth must be earned repeatedly, through constant proof, through unrelenting achievement. In adulthood, this performance becomes an expectation. Society admires the employee who answers emails at midnight, the parent who never admits struggle, the achiever who makes it look effortless. You are rewarded for sacrificing yourself. You are celebrated for your productivity. So long as your output remains high, no one asks about the cost. Then comes social media, the global stage for comparison. Here, everyone is curating their highlight reel. Success is constant. Achievement is effortless. Everyone else seems to be excelling while balanced, thriving while calm, succeeding without struggle. You compare your internal chaos to their external polish and conclude you're falling behind. You must work harder. You must achieve more. You must prove you belong in a world of people who seem to have it all figured out. But here is the quiet tragedy. The world cannot see you if you only show it your achievements. And you cannot rest if the world only values you for what you produce. You begin to sense it in the quiet moments, when you finish something major and feel nothing. When you receive an award and your first thought is wondering when you'll be found out. When you realize you've spent years chasing a version of success that leaves you emptier with each accomplishment. You try to remember what it felt like to do something simply because you enjoyed it, not because you needed to excel at it. But that memory is distant now, like trying to recall the face of someone you haven't seen in years. And the worst part is realizing how long you've carried the belief that your worth is contingent, that your value must be proven, that you are only as good as your last achievement. The world taught you to produce, and you listened because survival required it. But every perfect project, every flawless performance, every achievement that should have brought satisfaction but instead brought only temporary relief, these are weights you carry. And sooner or later, the weight becomes too much, which leads to the quiet collapse that follows the emotional cost of never being enough. There comes a moment when you realize you're exhausted. Not the kind of tired that sleep fixes, but the kind that lives in your bones, that makes even simple things feel impossible. You look at your list of achievements, at everything you've built, at all the evidence that should prove you're successful, and you feel hollow. You've shaped yourself into someone impressive for so long that you've forgotten what you actually enjoy. The person you once were, the one who played without purpose, who created without perfection, who existed without needing to prove anything, has dissolved into the person others needed you to be. You crave rest. You want to slow down. You want someone to tell you you've done enough, but when you try to stop, panic rises. Who are you without your achievements? What is your value if you're not constantly producing? The thought of being ordinary, of being simply human, feels like death. So without meaning to, you keep going. But now every task feels heavier. Your focus fractures. You make mistakes you never used to make, and each one sends you spiraling. You snap at people you love. You cry over things that shouldn't matter. Your body begins to rebel. Headaches, insomnia, exhaustion that won't lift, anxiety that won't quiet. It is not that you're failing. It is that you're breaking under the weight of a standard no human was meant to carry. You cannot be perfect. You were never supposed to be. But somewhere along the way, you forgot that being flawed is not the same as being broken. That making mistakes is not the same as being worthless. That you are allowed to be human. Your relationships suffer because you cannot let anyone see you struggle. You keep everyone at arm's length, not from coldness but from shame. You cannot let them see the mess, the doubt, the exhaustion. You fear that if they see you as anything less than competent, they'll leave. So you stay behind the wall of your own making, accomplished and alone. Psychologists call this perfectionism-driven burnout. The chronic stress of impossible standards literally changes your brain chemistry. Cortisol stays elevated, serotonin drops. Your nervous system remains in constant fight or flight. You become irritable, detached, numb. The things that used to bring you joy feel empty. The achievements that used to matter feel meaningless. And here lies the heartbreaking truth. Perfectionism is not excellence. It is fear wearing the mask of ambition. It is a life spent proving your worth instead of living from it. But it doesn't have to stay this way. There is a way back. A way to return to yourself, slowly, imperfectly, honestly. A way to let your humanity become acceptable again. And that journey begins with learning how to fail without falling apart. Healing does not begin with suddenly accepting yourself. It begins quietly, often in the smallest moment. The moment you submit work that's good enough instead of perfect. The moment you ask for help, even though it makes you feel vulnerable. The moment you try something new and allow yourself to be terrible at it, it begins the first time you allow yourself to wonder, what if being imperfect doesn't mean being worthless? At first, lowering your standards feels like giving up. Your chest tightens. Your mind screams that you're being lazy, that you're settling, that this is how you become mediocre. The fear isn't irrational. It's familiar. The brain believes it is protecting you. But you are no longer that child who needed to be perfect to earn love. So the work now is not to become perfect at being imperfect, but to learn to tolerate being human, to let the messy, uncertain, flawed version of yourself exist alongside the accomplished one, to allow failure to happen without letting it define you. Healing begins when you start noticing the moments where perfectionism speaks. When you're rewriting an email for the 10th time, when you're avoiding starting something because you can't guarantee you'll excel, when you're lying awake replaying a conversation, analyzing every word. In those moments, instead of obeying the voice, you pause, you breathe. You ask yourself gently, what if it's okay to just be good enough? What if I'm allowed to be learning? What if my worth isn't on trial? The first time you let something be imperfect, it will feel like failure. Your body will resist, your mind will panic, but the world will not end. The people around you will not suddenly see you differently. And slowly, your nervous system learns something new. Imperfection does not lead to abandonment. You begin to practice what psychologists call self-compassion, speaking to yourself the way you would speak to someone you love. When you make a mistake, instead of harsh criticism, you offer understanding. This is hard. I'm learning. It's okay to not know everything. When you fall short of a goal, instead of berating yourself, you acknowledge effort. I tried my best with what I had. That matters. Boundaries become less about proving your strength and more about honoring your limits. Rest becomes less about earning it and more about recognizing you're human. And vulnerability begins to feel less like weakness and more like the only path to real connection. You will lose some things along the way. You might achieve less by conventional measures. Your productivity might drop. Some people who only valued your output might drift. But what you gain is immeasurable. You gain yourself back. You gain the ability to enjoy what you're doing instead of just completing it. You gain relationships where people see you, not just what you produce. You do not need to be perfect to be worthy. You never did. You deserve to be valued for who you are, not just what you accomplish. Even in your uncertainty, even in your mistakes, even in your beautifully imperfect becoming. Healing is not becoming flawless. It is learning that your flaws are part of your humanity, not evidence against it. And now, all that remains is the final question. What does it mean to live without needing to prove yourself at all? What is a life if you never allow yourself to simply exist in it? Not the version you polish for the world, not the achievement-focused machine or the flawless performer, but you, the person who sometimes struggles, the person who makes mistakes, the person who is learning, growing, trying, failing, and trying again. There is a quiet tragedy in living behind your own accomplishments. You may succeed, excel, achieve, impress, and yet still feel a loneliness that runs deeper than any award can reach. Because worth cannot be earned through perfection. Belonging cannot be purchased with achievement, and no matter how much you accomplish, you cannot feel satisfied if you believe your value is always contingent. You spent so long proving yourself that you forgot you were never supposed to. You learned to be admired without being known, accomplished without being seen, successful without being at peace. The world applauded your achievements, your discipline, your excellence. But your heart, the one place untouched by applause, knew the truth. You were performing a life instead of living one. And it is not your fault. You adapted to survive. You worked to be chosen. You believed that to be loved, you had to be exceptional, flawless, beyond reproach. But now you stand at the threshold of a question you can no longer ignore. If you stop performing, who might finally see you? There is fear here, yes. The fear of being average, the fear of being criticized, the fear of disappointing people who expect excellence from you. But beneath that fear is something older, softer, and far more powerful: the desire to rest. To be accepted not for what you do, but for who you are. To be human is to be imperfect. Not to be polished, not to be beyond criticism, but to allow yourself to exist in the fullness of your flawed, uncertain, still learning humanity. To let someone see you struggle and stay. To let someone witness your mistakes and not turn away. To be loved not despite your imperfection, but including it. The truth you fear is the freedom you need. You will lose some things when you choose to be human. You might achieve less by some measures. You might disappoint people who only valued your output. But those who leave were loving your performance. And the ones who remain, the ones who see you rest and still stay, are the ones who are looking for you all along. You do not need to earn your place in the world by being flawless. You deserve to exist without proving anything. So let the standard loosen. Let the pressure ease. Let your humanity return. Begin again. Not as the perfect version you built to survive, but as the imperfect person who is finally ready to live.